The House will come to order. Prayer by the chaplain.
Let us pray. Almighty and loving God, we come to you, the source of all wisdom, to ask you to pour forth your Spirit upon these elected representatives, so that in the coming weeks and months they may act with prudence and sound judgment as they diligently seek to do what is wise and right for the common good of the people they are privileged to represent. We make this prayer in your powerful and holy name. Amen.
The chaplain for today is Deacon Nathan E. Allen from the Archdiocese of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. Pledge of Allegiance. Please remain standing and recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. I'll tell you when. Quorum is present. The clerk will read the journal of the preceding day.
Journal of the House, 89th session, 68th day, St. Paul, Minnesota, Monday, March 14th, 2016.
If there is no objection, further reading of the journal will be dispensed with, and the journal will be approved as corrected by the chief clerk. Hearing no objection, the journal is approved as corrected by the chief clerk. Reports of standing committees and divisions. A copy of this order of business has been placed on each member's desk. If there is no objection, the reports will be adopted. Hearing no objection, the reports are adopted. Second reading of House files.
Second reading House File number 606.
Second reading.
Second reading House File 1089.
Second reading.
Second reading House File 2650.
Second reading.
Second reading House File 2652.
Second reading.
Second reading House File 2797.
Second reading.
Second reading House File 2888.
Second reading.
Second reading House File 2956.
Second reading. Introduction of bills. The following House files have been offered for introduction today. The chief clerk will report the House files and give them their first reading.
Introduction and first reading of House Files 3128 through 3251.
First reading, House files 3128 through 3251. Report from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration.
Peppin from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration, pursuant to Rules 1.21 and 3.33, designates the following bills to be placed on the calendar for the day for Thursday, March 17, 2016, and establishes a pre-filing requirement for amendments offered to the following bills: House File number 2032 and Senate File number 209.
Motions and resolutions. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there's no objection, we'll take action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail.
This was just filed. Yes.
Anderson S. moves that House File number 1182 be recalled from the Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, Policy, and Finance and be re-referred to the Committee on Mining and Outdoor Recreational Policy.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson, to your motion.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this has all been talked, discussed on, and yes.
Any discussion on the Anderson motion? The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If Representative Anderson could just say a little bit about what the bill is, so we if she would yield.
She will yield. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I apologize, Representative Hansen. I was in the middle of a discussion and wasn't quite tracking what was going on. This is my bill dealing with organ donation. You'll probably remember it. We've heard it before. They've changed the mechanism of how it's being funded, and so that's going to be moved to the appropriate committee. So that's all it is.
Any further discussion on the Anderson motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the Anderson motion to recall and re-refer House File 1182 signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails.
Daniels moved that House File number 2742 be recalled from the Committee on Health and Human Services Reform and be re-referred to the Committee on Civil Law and Data Practices.
I recognize the member from Rice, Representative Daniels, to your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just want to move that file to civil law. It deals with closed captioning in like hospitals and clinics. and it went to HH policy by mistake, so just want to get it to the right place. Thank you.
Any discussion on the Daniels motion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the Daniels motion signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails.
Detmer and others introduced House Resolution Number 2, a House resolution expressing the sense of the House that June 27th be recognized as Post-Traumatic Stress Injury Awareness Day and that the month of June be recognized as Post-Traumatic Stress Injury Awareness Month. The resolutions being referred to the Veterans Affairs Division. Lesch moved that House File Number 1732 be recalled from the Committee on Ways and Means and be re-referred to the Committee on Civil Law and Data Practices.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesch, to your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'm moving that House File 1732 go to civil law for obvious reasons, and you all know why it needs to go there. Everybody in this body knows why this bill needs to go to civil law, because it contains data practices. And that is clearly in Rule 4.16, that any bill involving data practices or Chapter 13 needs to go to data practices. Now, this is another instance of us skipping civil law because it would be awkward. But members, you can't do that. You just can't. It gets us into a really bad pattern of doing this, a pattern that has already been established by flouting the rules that has occurred multiple times here this legislative session already. But just the basic reasons contained in the bill, lines 2.20 to 2.33, relate to the data that would be collected if Real ID is implemented. In Parent 7, identifying expected impacts resulting from Real ID Act implementation on the security, privacy, and control of data on individuals contained in records maintained by the Commissioner or any other state or local government entity, including inventorying verification systems and types of data that must be accessible to entities outside Minnesota, and the purpose for which the data must be made accessible. Then identifying the specific entities that will be provided access to the data and for what purpose. This is a key area of what civil law does, and analyzing the data security protocols required by federal law related to use of 2.28 and access to the data, and then finally developing approaches to maximize safeguarding data privacy and protection, including any recommendations for legislation to minimize the exposure of Minnesotans' data to security, privacy, and control standards under the Real ID Act that are less rigorous than protections provided under Minnesota statutes, Chapter 13, and other applicable state laws. Members, this specifically relates to protecting your constituents' private data under the implementation of this law. And if it doesn't go through civil law, you are completely flouting your fiduciary duty to ensure your constituents' data privacy. That not even to mention, then when this bill was originally passed, it went through civil law when it was originally passed. And there's a repealer on this that means it would take, it would remove that law that was passed originally under the Paletti administration. Mr. Speaker, would Representative Scott yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Scott, you had mentioned in committee the other day that there were two bills that were going to go through, and that this was the first one. Is it your contention that there is no way that we could achieve Real ID implementation with this bill alone?
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Lesch, for the question. I do not believe that they can do implementation with this bill alone because we don't provide any funding for implementation in this bill.
Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Pepin yield to a question?
She will yield. Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Representative Pepin. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Representative Scott. Can you assure the body that there is no way for the state to achieve Real ID implementation with this first bill alone?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Lesh. I don't have the bill in front of me, but it's my understanding that there has to be a second bill for it actually to be implemented, and they're working on language on that.
Okay.
And that there's no Chapter 13 requirements in this bill alone.
Thank you,
Representative
Pepin.
Lesh.
And Mr. Speaker, everyone in this body that has read the bill and knows the rule knows that we're breaking the rule if it doesn't go to civil law. We all know why you don't want it to go there. It's not particularly political. There are folks in each caucus that are divided on this issue, and you don't want to deal with it. But you have to deal with it, because by not dealing with it is how we get ourselves in this situation 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, once the feds finally tell us what we have to do with no adequate federal funding, by the way, and then we find out we didn't pass the bill the right way because we didn't consider it through the scope of proper data practices, which is what Rule 4.16 is designed to achieve. So let's not break the rule, members. I'd ask that you would support my motion that this bill be re-referred to civil law from Ways and Means. Thank you.
Further discussion. The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your concern on this bill, Representative Lesh. I appreciate that. And I do want to say that this bill, the first real ID bill that we're looking at here, does not actually amend any data practices, classifications, or Chapter 13 provisions. It does not grant any new data access or data sharing rights to any government entity. And it doesn't require the collection of any new type of personal data from anyone. This bill, the reference to Chapter 13 in this bill is only to direct the Department of Public Safety as far as what they have to provide us in a report. And they're just saying, you have to provide us this information as it relates to Chapter 13 and the reference that they give there. So, members, this does not need to come to civil law. I have assured Representative Lesh and the Civil Law Committee that the second bill will be coming to our committee. I will definitely want to see that second bill. This bill that Representative Smith is carrying, the report that we're asking the department to come up with does have to come back to the legislature. So, folks, again, there's nothing new in this bill as it relates to Chapter 13 that would require it to come here to the Civil Law and Data Practices Committee. Thank you.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Mariani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members. And members, I hope you're paying attention. I hope you're paying attention. In 2008 and 2009, this body acted decisively on this issue in a bipartisan manner, on the issue on the table in front of us right now, which is nothing short of the biggest private information data sharing possibility that we have faced as a state. That's why a decade ago, state after state after state across this country stood up to the federal government, stood up to the bill that they passed in the middle of the night with no debate, that stepped into our citizens' private information to create, in essence, a national ID card, and said no. And what's happened since then, as the federal government has consistently put the screws on American citizens and on our states, some states have capitulated, and some states have fought and won some hard-fought, well-earned battles with the federal government precisely on this issue of data privacy. And what we're about to do right here, right now on the floor of the House is not only deny the unanimous support in this body, but we're about to just hand it all over to the federal government. Members, I heard about a second bill, but quite frankly, the way this works is once you're in, you're in. And I heard about this bill's call for a report back on March 31st, which, by the way, members, our committee deadlines, April 1st. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with that report if it comes back and tells us what I'm about to tell you, because I think it's what it should tell you, which is once you're in, you're in. The way other states have dealt with this issue hasn't been to kick this down the field and say, oh, federal government, you can do what you want, and we'll take care of our data privacy issues later through state legislative action. Members, you're all elected members of this body. You know how this works. Once you're in, you're in. It doesn't matter what state law you pass, you have now signed on the dotted line to the federal bill and to the 5,000 plus pages, I know, I've seen them, of rules related to this bill. Once you're in, you're in. If you want to deal with the data privacy issues, do what Representative Lash has asked you to do here today. Send it to that body, that committee in our own body, who is charged with taking care of data privacy issues regarding the private information of Minnesota citizens. Members, this is not a partisan issue. Red states, blue states, and toss-up states have all had that tough negotiating with the federal government, and they've walked out with something to offer their citizens that's real in terms of providing some safe harbor for our data information. Members, what we know for a fact about the Real ID is that it simply does not protect any data. And quite frankly, as Representative Whalen commented on in the work group hearing we had on this issue, she caught on pretty quickly. She's sharp. She understood that some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. in the near future, or even further down, can change the nature of those data requirements. This is a different animal that we're dealing with, folks. It's a different animal. And that's why Republicans and Democrats a decade ago said, whoa, hold on a second. There are no data protection provisions in the Real ID. In fact, one of the things we discovered as we plowed through those thousands of pages of information is that there's an ability for the data that's collected, it's there. Email me, I'll send you the site, I'll send you a copy of it. There is the ability for that data to be shared with third-party groups. There's even language that says the federal government can sell that data. Those third-party groups can sell that data. This is data mining of your constituents, of your citizens, of the private information that they have. You know, Representative Cornish, you and I are not exactly on the same page on a number of gun issues, okay? But there's firearms information that's collected on driver's license. There is. You know that. Guess where that information is going to go if we sign on the dotted line with Real ID? If we move forward without caution on Real ID. And that information will be available for mining and for selling. I don't know how much we can do about that, but I think we can do what other states did, which is to create an internal process for us to be far more careful than what the motion, the original motion is here on today on the floor of the House. It's precisely why we have the committee that we have. House File 1732 does indeed speak to data privacy issues, as Representative Lesh shared. It explicitly asks for certain data protections reporting, even though, quite frankly, I don't think it works. But the subject is there and contained in this bill. And again, members, this is the most explicit, most biggest data information sharing bill that this body probably will ever see. Representative Scott, I sat next to you when we met with the Department of Homeland Security in the summer and the fall. We chatted among ourselves. You shared some real deep concerns about what is possible inside of Real ID. It's complex, members. My question is, what has happened to that concern, Representative Scott, rather? What's happened to that concern? You told KSTP that the data practices and data privacy issues are pretty vast. The amount of information that will be contained in these Real IDs is pretty concerning. Yes, I agree. So why isn't this bill in your committee? You told Tom Scheck people need to ask what you're willing to give up for this to be implemented as far as your civil liberties and your data privacy concerns. Yes, I agree. So members, I don't know what's changed your mind. I don't know what's changed the mind of the GOP majority in this House from our bipartisan vote of years ago. I don't know what's changed in your mind relative to the many statements that you have offered the press about your commitment to protecting and doing everything you can to protect the private information of your citizens. I don't know. What I do know is that in the last 10 years, we have had huge telling news about how far the federal government is willing to go in terms of digging into the information that you have an obligation to protect for your fellow citizens. We know about the massive phone data mining. I'm not an attorney, but those were at best questionable legal practices on the part of the federal government. And quite frankly, I don't think we even have a modern, mature, thoughtful framework to deal with the way information is stored and gathered nowadays. All the more reason for this bill to go to civil law and data practices. So members, I suspect we'll be talking about this in public. I suspect we'll be back talking about this in the floor of the House. I've posed some pretty simple, obvious questions to you all about why it's okay, why you're comfortable. I don't share that comfort. There are models, as I said, in other states that have dealt with this issue as best as they can. We know the federal government will accept this. Right now, at this moment, they're sitting, some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. is sitting and clapping and toasting and celebrating the fact that you're not doing your duty, that we're not doing our duty because he's going to get what he wants, but your constituents are not going to get what they deserve, what they need, and what they want. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask for a roll call on this motion.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I stand and urge this body to vote no on this motion. This bill simply allows the Department of Public Safety to be a part of the conversation. This bill allows us to get information so we can have a discussion about what the next bill will look like. Absent the Department of Public Safety giving us information, getting a fiscal note, we can't have an intelligent conversation about this bill. We just need to move forward on this bill. I urge you to vote no so we can get the information so then we can plan for what the next bill looks like. I urge you to vote no. Thank you.
The member from Anoka, Representative Whalen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Representative Mariani, for your kind words toward me and all the information you've gathered on this bill and your work in the past on it. I've spoken extensively with Senator Limmer on this as well, whom I'm sure many of you recall was the lead on this in the Senate. And I still am very concerned about Real ID in general. However, I want to echo Representative Smith's comments that all that we are trying to do is allow the department to participate in the conversation with us. Because of the concerns that I had and other colleagues had, we actually modified the bill we had previously quite a bit. We removed expedited rulemaking, among other things. So all that this bill does is allow the department to participate in the conversation with us. And Representative Mariani, you mentioned what other states are doing and models that they have. That's what we want to be able to have a conversation about. What are those other states doing and how we can choose a model that will be best for Minnesota. So members, I will also encourage you to vote no on this motion. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you. Will Representative Smith yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Thiessen.
Thank you. When I went online and looked at House File 1732, it's a bill about the Met Council, and we seem to be talking about Real ID. Can you enlighten me on that?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Mr. Speaker, Representative, that bill there was a delete all for this bill. Thank you.
Representative Thiessen.
Thank you. And Representative Smith, I see you also introduced a bill, House File 2700, which looks very similar to the language that's now in House File 1732. So did you basically take the language from the bill you introduced a couple days ago and insert it into 1732?
Are you asking him to yield?
Yeah, I would, if he would yield. Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
He will yield. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, could you repeat your question, please? Thank you.
Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I was looking, and House File 2700 was introduced a few days ago, which was a bill of yours relating to Real ID. So that's the House File number for that bill. And as I look at the two bills, well, the bill and then the amendment, it looks as if House File 2700's language was offered as an amendment in committee as a delete all and put into 1732. Is that essentially correct?
He will yield. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, upon further review, it wouldn't have needed to go to civil law.
You think the bill should go to civil law?
I do not think the bill should go to civil law.
Okay.
Representative Thiessen.
Mr. Speaker, that's a little bit unresponsive. Maybe he's anticipating my question, I suppose, which would, I think that 2700 is essentially the language that got inserted into 1732. 2700 was referred by the majority leader to the Civil Law Committee. So apparently the people were making decisions about where Real ID should have been heard, which is House File 2700, was referred to the Civil Law Committee. That's where 2700 is sitting right now. Then that language is taken and plopped into another bill, a delete all amendment, which I think will have the same 6.31 problems under, which was in transportation, and then sent to Ways and Means, skipping over the Civil Law Committee. So if it was good and a good reason for us to send 2700, which is the identical bill that we're facing right now on this motion, to civil law, I question why we shouldn't actually have sent this bill from transportation to civil law. The majority's already made the decision it should be in civil law, that that's the correct jurisdiction for the bill. Maybe the majority leader will yield as to why she made the decision to send the bill, the 2700, to civil law.
She will yield. The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. Well, as you know, the Speaker makes that referral. I can dig more into it, but I don't make that referral.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Will the Speaker lead for a point of parliamentary inquiry?
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
Why did you refer the bill 2700 to civil law?
Representative Thiessen, as the presiding officer, I can't comment on why it was sent there. I can just confirm that House File 2700 was sent to the Committee on Civil Law and Data Practices. And I am also not aware if it's in the same format as the bill that's under discussion. The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, members, on this motion, I mean, Representative Lesh and Representative Mariani have made very strong arguments why this bill, as well as the precedent of anybody that was here in 2009, understands that the reason that these issues around Real ID are so concerning, among other things, to many members in this body, has to do with privacy issues. The identical bill that, it's not identical, there was changes to the rulemaking language in 1732, but the reasons this bill should have gone to civil law are in the amendment to 1732. That identical language is in the bill in 2700 or close to it. That bill was referred to civil law. That tells me that the appropriate jurisdiction for this bill by the majority's own decision is that this bill should go to civil law. Why are you avoiding it? I don't know. I can't explain that for you. Why you feel the need to flout the rules once again, I don't understand. But that is exactly what you're doing. Maybe you're afraid that there's concerns that may arise in a civil law discussion that you don't want to have heard. I imagine that's what it was. I think the easiest course right now is just to accept Representative Lesh's motion, send it to civil law where it can have a hearing yet this week, get it back to the floor next week, and we're moving on very quickly. There's just no reason at this time to be circumventing the process. So members, I would urge you to support Representative Lesh's motion. I would urge you to support what the majority has already decided is the proper course. And I would urge you, at least this time, to follow the rules.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for permitting the opportunity to wrap up on this. Now, if any of you want a safe phasing measure, just give me a sign, and I'll withdraw the motion. I'll totally do it. I don't see one. You all know this needs to go to civil law. Let me just state briefly, when you go to law school, and Representative Pepin went to law school, you'll learn the method called IRAC, okay? Issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. Issue, should this bill have gone to civil law? Rule, well, we got that right here. Any bill that substantially affects either Minnesota Statutes Chapter 13 or other government data practices statutes, that's the rule, that it must be referred to civil law. Analysis, you sent 2700 there, obviously you thought, and it was the same language, obviously you thought that should have gone to civil law. Number two, I don't know too many of you on that side of the aisle who, when the federal government comes knocking at your door and handing you an order, you respond, "Thank you, sir, may I have another?" Okay? But if you in fact grease the skids for Real ID for the feds on this, I guarantee you it's your delegates at your BPOUs that care about this a lot more than ours do in general. And you are in a position of having to go answer, why did I completely capitulate to the federal government on Real ID, especially when an extension was granted? Why? You're going to have to answer that question. If not this cycle, then next cycle around. Why did you do that? The further analysis would, and I'm not going to go into the same text that I read you before that clearly states this bill affects government data practices statutes. There are about 7 different paragraphs in there that state that affects government data practices statutes. So the conclusion is the bill must be sent to civil law. Members, you don't get to start with C on the IRAC. You don't get to start with the conclusion. My chair doesn't want to deal with it. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to grease the skids through. That's the conclusion. You don't start there. You start with the analysis and decide whether or not you're going to follow the rules. So I hope you will follow the rules that we all agreed to, that you passed, and that you'll vote green on the motion. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, upon further review, I would have made a motion to move my original bill out of civil law. Nonpartisan House research states that this bill does not substantially affect data practices in any way that triggers Rule 4.16. The bill is taking the proper course. I ask for a no vote. Thank you.
Any further discussion on the Lesh motion? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the motion. The clerk will close the roll. There being 56 ayes and 70 nays, the motion does not prevail. Members, we have a former member in the chamber. Please join me in welcoming former member Jim Rosberg, who served from Isani County from 1995 to 2000. Announcements. The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The legislative auditor evaluation suggestion deadline is on Friday. For those of you who have not completed your picks, I have the forms right here. You can pick them up and do that and get that completed. And in addition, Mr. Speaker, if the members of the DFL members of the House Environment and Policy and Finance Committee could meet in the retiring room right after session for 5-10 minutes. Thank you.
Any further announcements? The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I move that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 4 p.m. Thursday, March 17th, 2016.
Representative Pepin moves that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns until 4 o'clock p.m. Thursday, March 17th, 2016. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. Representative Pepin.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
Representative Pepin moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails, and the House stands adjourned until 4 o'clock p.m. Thursday, March 17th, 2016.